In the dimly lit, chaotic offices of Allied intelligence, where the walls were plastered with maps of the Atlantic and telegrams scrawled with urgent warnings arrived by the hour, a young girl, barely 17, sat quietly at her desk with nothing but a piece of chalk and an uncanny mind that seemed to see the invisible currents of war that others could not, and she whispered a question that would shake Naval. Warfare to its core. What if the simplest idea could destroy the mightiest fleet? While the world outside was convulsed with the roar of artillery, the relentless thunder of German U-boats prowling the seas, and the terrified reports of convoys disappearing without a trace, she began plotting something so audacious, so deceptively simple, that her commanders initially laughed, thinking it childish, reckless, even insane. Yet it was precisely this crazy chalk trick, something so unorthodox, so seemingly insignificant, that would make German submarines sink at 3 times the normal rate, altering the trajectory of entire naval battles. And the hook for you, the viewer, is to imagine for a moment that a single girl, armed only with chalk, paper, and pure intellectual audacity, could outwit one of the most disciplined, terrifying military machines the world had ever known, because as she drew intricate patterns and calculations on the blackboard, mapping ocean currents, convoy movements, and predicted U-boat paths, she was not just playing a game of strategy, she was orchestrating a symphony of destruction. Each chalk line a note in the eventual catastrophe that would strike the German fleet, and you must ask yourself, how could a teenager's scribbles on a chalkboard create fear that rivaled entire battleships? Because what seemed trivial to everyone else was actually a revolutionary method of deception. Psychological manipulation and precise mathematical calculation that the Allies would implement to devastating effect. And as she moved her chalk across the board, tracing complex patterns that mirrored the shifting tides, the sonar readings, the intelligence reports smuggled from spies and codebreakers, each mark represented not just theory, but the blueprint for a strike so lethal that when the first submarine fell, senior admirals barely believed it. And the suspense builds because the Germans were utterly baffled, scanning the ocean, reading charts, trying to understand how their U-boats were being intercepted, destroyed, or misdirected 3 times faster than anyone expected. While she, in that dim room, smiled quietly, knowing that her chalk had become more powerful than torpedoes, more strategic than fleet formations, more terrifying than the roar of naval artillery. And the tension escalates because her method wasn't mere luck. It was a combination of genius, audacity, and daring deception. And as the weeks passed, she refined her calculations, invented tricks to mislead enemy sonar, misdirect convoys, and exploit weaknesses in German patrol patterns, each operation increasing her kill count exponentially, yet remaining invisible to the naked eye, like a shadow in the ocean. And the suspense hooks you deeper because even her commanding officers didn't fully understand the brilliance unfolding on that blackboard, and they had to trust her calculations. Her intuition, her uncanny ability to predict enemy movements, which was exactly why this story is mesmerizing. It's terrifying and completely unbelievable, because as the German fleet sent reports of losses, higher-ups shook their heads in disbelief, wondering how a childish trick could dismantle months of strategic planning. And the question lingers, could anyone survive the consequences of her genius if they were on the receiving end? While every chalk mark became a harbinger of doom. And the climax of this point is the realization that the simplest, most underestimated tools, a piece of chalk, a keen mind, and fearless imagination, can alter the course of history, redefine what is possible in war, and leave enemies bewildered, terrified, and defeated. Yet the suspense intensifies because she herself was unaware of the full power she wielded until the first fleet was sunk. Convoys diverted, and German captains wrote frantic letters back to Berlin, questioning their own judgment. And as we move through this story, you will see that her crazy chalk trick wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a psychological weapon. A method of warfare that made the Germans second-guess every decision, every course, every signal, because each chalk diagram was a trap, a blueprint for chaos, silent order to the ocean itself to betray the enemy. And the tension escalates further, because the more the Allies implemented her strategy, the more spectacular the results. The more catastrophic for the Germans, and the more unexplainable, till rumors spread among sailors and officers that some invisible force was haunting the Atlantic, guiding torpedoes, diverting fleets, sinking ships. The hook that keeps you glued to this video is to imagine that the girl responsible for all of this was, by appearance, fragile, young, and underestimated. Yet her mind became the deadliest weapon of the sea, and as she traced her final lines for the night, charting the next week's attacks, you must ask yourself, how can one girl with chalk, courage, and intellect rewrite the rules of naval warfare, making German U-boats disappear 3 times faster than predicted while the enemy has no idea why? And as the young girl continued her work, chalk scraping across the blackboard like a whisper of doom, she began noticing patterns in the German U-boat patrol schedules that no one else had seen before. Subtle shifts in timing, slight deviations in reported positions, inconsistencies in convoy interceptions, all details that seemed irrelevant to the average officer, but, when combined with her diagrams, formed a terrifyingly precise prediction system. And this is where the suspense hooks you even deeper. Imagine a teenage girl predicting the movements of highly trained submarine crews across hundreds of miles of open ocean with nothing more than intuition, math, and a piece of chalk, and as she traced currents, plotted angles of torpedo launch zones, and considered the behavior of sonar operators who could barely detect a ripple in the water, she realized that her trick wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary, a form of psychological and operational warfare that the Germans would never anticipate, because they relied on brute force, technology, and strict protocols, while she relied on imagination, calculation, and deception, bending reality itself to the advantage of the Allies. And the tension intensifies because every time she drew a new line, calculated a new path, or projected a convoy's location 3 days in advance, she was essentially orchestrating the destruction of enemy vessels before a single shell was fired, before a single torpedo left a U-boat tube, and while her commanders marveled, the Germans panicked, unsure how every U-boat under their command seemed to be intercepted faster than ever, sinking at a rate 3 times higher than previously recorded. And the suspense escalates because at this moment, the girl's chalk had become a silent weapon, invisible yet unstoppable, turning the Atlantic into a trap. Every mark she made on the board cascading into catastrophic failure for the enemy. And you must imagine the fear spreading through the German naval command, officers questioning intelligence reports, captains afraid to venture beyond sight of the coast, entire submarines mysteriously lost while commanders scrambled to understand how such precise ambushes were possible, while the girl, unaware of the chaos she had leashed, simply adjusted her calculations, made minor corrections to ocean currents, factored in weather changes, and quietly smirked at the thought that her simple chalk diagrams were more effective than fleets, mines, or aerial bombardments. And the narrative hooks you further because this was not a one-time stroke of luck. It was a continuous system she refined daily, turning predictions into realities, mistakes into lessons, and fear into a weapon that multiplied with every sinking, every intercepted convoy, every German report written in trembling ink. And the question that grips your mind now is, how can a single mind, a single pencil, or a piece of chalk dominate entire fleets and rewrite naval strategy while the enemy has no idea why? And as you pondered this, she began incorporating more variables into her diagrams, considering moon phases, tidal changes, wind patterns, sonar limitations, radio intercepts, and dive-in psychological tendencies of individual U-boat commanders, all while maintaining the simplicity that made her approach deceptively crazy in the eyes of her superiors, yet terrifyingly effective in practice. And as her models became more refined, the Allies began executing attacks with surgical precision, sinking more U-boats than ever, saving countless ships, cutting off critical supply lines, while the Germans, desperate to adapt, could only guess, panic, and overcomplicate their own operations. And the suspense is almost unbearable because at this moment, the entire war at sea hinged on a teenage girl's chalkboard, her intellect, her creativity, and the silent, invisible power of her ideas. And as reports continued to arrive of convoys saved, submarines destroyed, and enemies bewildered, she realized that her trick was not merely tactical, but strategic. Not merely clever, but revolutionary, altering the course of naval warfare forever. And the hook for the viewer, the tension you cannot look away from, is that every sinking, every failure for the Germans, every panic-stricken officer traced back to a chalk line drawn by one brilliant mind. A mind that defied expectations, defied norms, defied the very notion of who could wage war and how. And as we move deeper into the story, you will see how her methods evolved. How her simple, crazy idea grew into an unstoppable system of intelligence, deception, and destruction. And the suspense rises because even her closest allies could not fully comprehend how she predicted, orchestrated, and executed with such consistent perfection. And the chilling question lingers: what happens when a single mind, armed only with chalk and courage, outsmarts the most lethal submarines in the world, again and again, while the enemy scrambles helplessly, unable to stop her? And as the weeks turned into months, her chalk diagrams became more than maps. They became the blueprint of an unseen war. A war waged not on the waves, but in the minds of men who believed themselves masters of the ocean. Yet every calculation she made, every line she drew, every subtle adjustment to a predicted U-boat route sent shockwaves through the enemy's ranks. And the suspense hooks you even further because the Germans, despite having advanced technology, highly trained crews, and decades of naval experience, were now reacting to a mind that was unpredictable, fearless, and astonishingly precise. And the tension is almost unbearable when you imagine entire fleets being rerouted, convoys escaping ambushes, submarines intercepted, not because of brute force, but because of the foresight, imagination, and quiet brilliance of a single teenage girl who understood patterns, probabilities, and human psychology far better than the enemy did. And she began introducing subtle deceptions, fake convoy positions, misreported coordinates, false sonar readings, all carefully calculated on her chalkboard, so that when the Germans acted, they unknowingly sailed into traps she had predicted days earlier. And the psychological impact was devastating. Commanders questioned themselves. Officers argued, crews panicked, yet she remained calm, adjusting numbers, drawing circles, plotting angles with a steady hand. And the suspense deepens because every line, every curve, every mark of chalk was a potential death sentence for the enemy, yet invisible to anyone else. And her influence grew as she coordinated with Allied intelligence officers who, despite initial skepticism, realized that her methods were unparalleled. And the stakes escalated because she was now responsible not just for individual U-boats, but for entire convoy operations, where one small miscalculation could mean hundreds of lives lost. Yet she navigated the complexity with astonishing clarity, seeing connections others could not, predicting enemy reactions with eerie accuracy. And the tension hooks the viewer because each successful prediction reinforced the myth of her genius. More fearful, more paranoid, and yet none of them suspected a girl, armed only with chalk in her mind, was the source of their nightmare. And the suspense is heightened further when you consider that she was still learning, still experimenting, still refining her techniques, pushing boundaries, questioning assumptions, and discovering new ways to manipulate both the enemy and the battlefield itself. And as she continued, she began noticing patterns in human behavior, the way fear spreads, the way rumors escalate, the way panic can cripple decision-making, and she integrated this into her diagrams, creating strategies that were as much about psychology as about math, positioning, or technology. And the hook for the viewer is irresistible. Imagine the terror of an enemy who cannot see you, cannot predict you, and is being dismantled systematically by a mind no older than 17. And the suspense reaches another peak as she plotted her most audacious trick yet. A series of fake convoy routes designed to lure entire flotillas into deadly ambushes, ensuring maximum destruction with minimal risk. And as she traced each line, calculated each angle, and imagined each outcome, she realized that her chalkboard had become more than a tool. It had become a weapon of war, a silent partner in the Allied effort, and a nightmare for German commanders. And the tension escalates because these diagrams, these lines, these calculations were invisible in their genius yet lethal in their execution. And as the first set of ambushes unfolded, the reports came flooding in. U-boats sunk, crews captured, strategic positions compromised. And the Allies stunned at the efficiency of these operations, while the Germans were left scrambling to understand what had gone wrong, and the hook deepens. Could it really be the work of a single teenage girl? Or was there some other force at play? And as her reputation grew among Allied officers, whispers of her methods circulated. Some calling it madness, some calling it genius, but all agreeing that the results were undeniable. And the suspense grips you even more because every operation, every diagram, every chalk line was a calculated risk, a dance with death, a psychological battle where she was always several steps ahead, orchestrating chaos, manipulating perception, predicting reactions, and ensuring that her enemies were always one move behind. And the climax of this point builds as you realize that her crazy chalk trick wasn't just a tactic. It was a revolution in naval warfare. A combination of intellect, creativity, courage, and intuition that allowed one girl to control the fate of ships, crews, and entire naval operations, turning the Atlantic into her chessboard, the German fleet into her pawns. And every viewer is left on the edge of their seat asking, how could a girl, armed with nothing more than chalk and audacity, alter the course of war itself? And the suspense lingers, because while the Germans searched desperately for the source of their misfortune, she continued quietly, drawing, calculating, and planning unstoppable, unseen, and utterly brilliant. Until the final shock, entire convoys were rerouted, U-boats destroyed at triple the rate, and the world would never look at chalk strategy, or a teenage genius the same way again. And as the girl's chalk diagrams grew more intricate, mapping the Atlantic with astonishing precision, she began factoring in not only ocean currents, convoy speeds, and U-boat patrol patterns, but also the unpredictable human element, the fatigue of crews, the overconfidence of commanders, the miscommunications between officers, and the subtle psychological cues that often dictated whether a submarine would be found or lost. And the suspense intensifies because these were variables no traditional naval strategy could fully account for. Yet she, with nothing more than intuition, observation, and careful calculation, could anticipate the ripple effects of every minor deviation, predicting outcomes days in advance. And the tension hooks you because every decision she made was a gamble with real lives at stake. Yet she approached it with a calm and clarity that belied her age, a mind so focused that she could envision entire fleets, entire waves of attacks, and the resulting chaos, all while remaining invisible to the enemy and nearly imperceptible to her own commanders. And as reports of U-boats sinking at unprecedented rates flooded in, the Allies began to rely on her chalkboard like a sacred instrument, while the Germans could only react in confusion, scrambling desperately, trying to decipher the unseeable force that seemed to anticipate every maneuver. And the suspense grips you further because the girl's genius was invisible in action her chalk marks. Her calculations, her predictions could not be detected by sonar or intercepted by code. They existed solely in her mind and on the board. Yet the effects were catastrophic for the enemy, altering the course of battles and saving countless Allied lives. And the hook deepens as you imagine the terror of German crews who, despite following orders perfectly, found themselves intercepted again and again, their confidence eroding, their faith in strategy replaced by panic and paranoia, while she quietly refined her methods, tested new hypotheses, experimented with different approaches, all with the same unrelenting focus. And the suspense escalates because no one could have predicted how far she would go, how bold her methods would become, or the scope of destruction that would follow. And as she began instructing select officers, teaching them to understand her logic and methods without revealing the full extent of her calculations, the operations became even more effective, creating a feedback loop where her predictions, when applied, produced more data, which in turn allowed her to refine future predictions. And the tension grips you, because this was a form of warfare entirely new, combining mathematics, psychology, intuition, and audacity. And as the Germans continued to lose U-boats at an alarming rate, their frustration and fear spread through the ranks, undermining morale, creating confusion, and forcing mistakes. And the suspense hooks the viewer because all of this was orchestrated by a single girl with chalk, patience, and brilliance. And the climax builds as she plans an operation so audacious that entire flotillas would be rerouted into traps that appeared accidental to the enemy, but were in fact carefully engineered, ensuring maximum destruction with minimum risk. And the tension rises further because every line on her board, every calculation, every assumption had to be perfect, or the consequences could be catastrophic for Allied ships as well. Yet she executed with such precision that mistakes were virtually non-existent. And the hook lingers as you realize that she was not just predicting enemy movements, she was shaping them, guiding them like a master puppeteer, forcing the Germans into choices that would seal their own fate. And the suspense deepens because the enemy could neither see her nor understand her. Yet every success she achieved amplified fear and paranoia, creating an invisible psychological battlefield in addition to the physical one. And the climax of this section is the understanding that her chalkboard, her crazy idea, was more lethal than any weapon, more effective than any fleet, more transformative than any known tactic. And the viewer is left breathless, asking, how could one girl, armed only with intellect, audacity, and chalk, dismantle the most feared naval force in history, manipulate the ocean itself, and alter the course of a war? And as she traced the final lines for her most ambitious operation yet, the tension reaches its peak, leaving everyone who studies her story stunned, awed, and questioning the very limits of human ingenuity, patience, and courage. And as the war drew on and the echoes of countless battles faded into the cold, endless waves of the Atlantic, the story of the girl whose crazy chalk trick had rewritten the rules of naval warfare reached its inevitable crescendo. And the hook grips you immediately. How could a single teenage mind armed with nothing but intuition, audacity, and a piece of chalk dismantle an entire fleet, outsmart elite submarine crews, and turn the ocean into a trap so lethal that no captain, no officer, no commander could escape its consequences? Because by now, her diagrams had become legend. Her methods a combination of predictive genius, psychological manipulation, and fearless innovation. And even as Allied officers marveled at her results, Germans scrambled desperately, trying in vain to counteract the unseen force that seemed to anticipate every maneuver, every course, every strategy. And the suspense intensifies as you imagine entire fleets rerouted into traps she had designed weeks in advance. Convoys saved, submarines sunk, lives spared, and yet she never claimed credit, never sought recognition. Her brilliance existing quietly behind chalk dust, behind scribbled lines on a blackboard, behind calculations that transformed entire naval operations. And as the final operations unfolded, it became clear that her trick was not merely clever or lucky, it was revolutionary. A complete redefinition of how intelligence, foresight, and creativity could be wielded as a weapon of war. And the tension hooks you deeper because the Germans, despite their training, technology, and experience, were being outmaneuvered by someone they could not see, predict, or comprehend. A silent strategist whose influence stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and countless lives. And the suspense escalates because each sinking, each intercepted convoy, each failed mission for the enemy reinforced the mythos of her genius, making her a phantom commander in the minds of those she outwitted. And as she continued refining her methods, teaching selected officers to implement her strategies without ever revealing the full scope of her intellect, the effectiveness of her operations multiplied exponentially, demonstrating that the simplest, most underestimated tool's a piece of chalk, a mind unafraid to think differently, a daring spirit could outperform the most complex fleets and weapons. And as the final weeks of the conflict drew near, the cumulative impact of her work became undeniable. German U-boats sunk 3 times faster than ever before, Allied convoys safer, and the tide of war subtly, irreversibly shifted, yet the hook remains. The suspense unresolved for the viewer. How did a single girl, armed only with chalk and courage, alter the course of history? And what can her story teach us about the power of ingenuity, creativity, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds? And as she finally set down her chalk, exhausted, triumphant, and unseen by the enemy, the ocean no longer seemed vast and unknowable, but instead a canvas on which her mind had painted a masterpiece of strategy, fear, and foresight, a lesson in how brilliance, daring, and a refusal to accept limits can reshape the world, leaving the viewer with the final shiver of awe, the story of one girl, her chalk, and the German fleet that could never escape her intellect. Forever cemented in history as a testament to what one extraordinary mind can accomplish against the impossible.